Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the virtual Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art. Today, we gather to discuss the story of The Learning Tree by Gordon Parks, who was an internationally acclaimed photographer, writer, poet, musician, and filmmaker. But before Parks made his name around the world, he was a Kansas native growing up in Fort Scott. The Learning Tree is a fictional story based on his experiences of living in Kansas during the 19 teens and 1920s. Thank you all for joining us. So The Learning Tree was a novel that was published in 1963, and then Parks wrote, produced, and directed a film version in 1968, and that movie was released in 1969. In doing so, Parks made history by becoming the first African American to make a Hollywood studio film. My name is Aileen Wang, and I am a curator at the Beach Museum of Art and one of the hosts of tonight's program. Before I introduce my co-hosts, I'd like to acknowledge that the state of Kansas is historically home to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Many Native nations utilize the Western Plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers, and it's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation for this institution, the first land grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, was and still is stolen land. We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential. I'd like to remind you that this program offers closed captioning. You can click on the CC icon at the bottom or top of your Zoom screen to access. Now, to introduce my co-hosts. Co-hosting with me are Katherine Karlin, author, poet, and associate professor of English who teaches courses in creative writing and film. Co-director of The Learning Tree, a Gordon Parks digital archive, a website currently in development that will offer a curated repository of archival materials related to Gordon Parks's filming of The Learning Tree in Fort Scott, including photographs during the filming and interviews with Fort Scott residents who were involved in the film. And Katie will show us some images and even a clip from an interview later. Katie will teach a course also on the Learning Tree film and African American film that were developed around that time. And I think that, is that in the fall or spring, Katie?
That's going to be in the fall. Yeah.
Okay. So fall of this year.
Fall, right. Fall of 2021.
Katie will be teaching a course on the Learning Tree and African American films. Next is my other co-host, Tara Coleman, Associate Professor and Web Services Librarian for Kansas State University Libraries. She also coordinates the library's Dow Center for Multicultural and Community Studies and serves as a university ombudsperson. She's also the coordinator for the university's Common Reading program, the K-State First Book. I'd like to take a moment to also acknowledge our webinar moderator, Jen Harlan, who is behind the scenes making sure everything runs smoothly. Thank you, Jen. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Director of the Gordon Parks Museum in Fort Scott, Kurt Sharp, who is joining us today. Hope he will chime in during the discussion with his knowledge of Gordon Park's history in Fort Scott and behind the scenes during the filming of the Learning Tree in Fort Scott. This program is part of K-State's Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Week. And it's also a teaser for the K-State Gordon Parks project, which will kick off this fall. The Beach Museum will have an exhibition of photographs by Gordon Parks, selected by the artist and donated to K-State in 1973. I am a co-curator of that exhibition along with the Beach Museum registrar, Sarah Price. A partner exhibition of contemporary photography will also be featured by Manhattan photographer Doug Barrett. The two exhibitions will be both in person and online. The Learning Tree, a Gordon Parks digital archive, is also part of this project, and it is headed by Katie and Gordon Parks project collaborators, Cameron Leader-Picon and Mark Crosby from K-State English. We will also have a star-studded set of programs related to the exhibition and the digital archive, including a talk by Oscar and BAFTA-winning filmmaker and Kansan Kevin Wilmot, and also a concert featuring jazz musician Terrence Blanchard and multimedia artist Andrew Scott in collaboration, and will feature Gordon Parks photographs. So we're really excited about the Gordon Parks project, and please watch out for announcements for those events and exhibitions and the digital archive. Now, when we get going on the discussion, please write your comments in the Q&A section, which would be an icon under your screen, below your screen or above your screen if you're using an iPad. Now I will hand over the mic to Katie. Katie, take it away.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Aileen and the Beach Museum for organizing this opportunity for us to discuss the Learning Tree, an important historical landmark, not only because it's the first Hollywood film to be directed by an African-American, but it's also one of the few cinematic representations of rural Black life in the Midwest. I'd also like to add, I think both the book and movie have real artistic importance and provide us with one of the few examples ever of a filmmaker adapting his own novel to the screen. And by studying it, we really get a lot of insights into the kind of decisions that a filmmaker makes when transferring his story from page to screen. Now, the Kansas State digitizing project, the Learning Tree of Gordon Parks Archive, has been digitizing artifacts from the shoot of the 1969 movie. I'm gonna show you a few of these images. This digitizing project has been done with a generous grant from the Kansas Humanities Council, and also with our cooperation with Hale Library, the Gordon Parks Museum at Fort Scott, and various people who have interviewed for the project. You're going to hear in a little bit a clip from the interview, an interview with the actress Carol Graham, who played Big Mabel in The Learning Tree, known as Carol Lamond at the time. Our hope is to preserve and make these images available to Gordon Parks scholars, as well as to a general audience who's interested in learning more about the Learning Tree. So we're going to take a look at a few images that were taken by Norman Tanis. Norman Tanis was an academic librarian, and as a young man, he was working at Pittsburgh State, as a librarian there. When he heard that Gordon Parks was shooting a movie up the road in Fort Scott, he grabbed his camera, drove up, and just hung around the set and took some shots. And he donated these pictures to Hale Library. So this is one of the things that we've been digitizing. And this gives us a really great, candid, kind of on the street look at what was involved in this location shot. So the exterior shots of the Learning Tree were shot in Fort Scott, and it's always a difficult choice to shoot on location. It means you're leaving Los Angeles, you have to transport the cast and crew someplace else, you have to lodge them, feed them. You don't have the immediate support of the studio for any technical problems that may come up. And you have to deal with local traffic regulations, maybe unpredictable weather. And I think this is just an interesting shot because you can see the 1960s and the 1920s here, with some people in period costumes, some people as crew members who are just in contemporary clothing, and a horse and buggy in front of the Phillips 66 station. So you see the combination there of both the 20s mise en scène from the movie, as well as the town in the 1960s. Shooting in Fort Scott was a particularly fraught decision for Gordon Parks because Fort Scott had obviously been the model for Cherokee Flats, the thinly veiled fictional town of the Learning Tree. And many Fort Scotters were not too happy with the way the town was represented when the 1963 novel came out. However, Parks clearly felt it was very important to get exterior shots, buildings, and public places that he knew as a child. Fort Scott had changed a lot between the 1920s and the 1960s. And in fact, in southeastern Kansas, in the 1920s, the Black population was between 20 and 25%. By the 1960s, when the Learning Tree was shot, it had dropped down to about 8%, subject to the great migration of Blacks leaving rural areas for cities. Gordon Parks himself, in fact, documented this in his Back to Fort Scott photo essay, when he went back in the 50s to track down many of his classmates and found them not in Fort Scott, but having moved to cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and San Diego. But Gordon Parks immediately created goodwill on the set by hiring many of the local people, some as crew members, many as extras, asking them to show up in period costume and come to some of the big crowd scenes, like the courthouse scene. As you can see here, some extras relaxing outside after shooting that scene. And some people just came to hang out and see how a movie was made. And here's some girls who are obviously in their 1960s clothing. They're not in period costume, who are hanging around the set. This is Kyle Johnson, who plays Newt, relaxing between takes with some of the other cast members and extras. It's pretty clear from some of these pictures the kind of relaxed and accessible atmosphere that was created around the set, where even a young child passing by could relax on one of the actors' chairs here. This tone was clearly set by Gordon Parks himself, who made himself accessible, friendly, and just accommodating to everybody. And I just want to reemphasize something Aileen said. Kirk Sharp is with us, who is not only the director of the Gordon Parks Museum at Fort Scott, but actually was a boy in Fort Scott and visited the set and can speak very vividly about his memories there, which I hope he will. This is the actress Estelle Evans, who played Sarah, just another lovely picture that was taken around the set. These are some actors relaxing on the set. Russell Thorson, who plays Judge Kavanaugh, Mira Waters, who plays Arcella, and Carol Lamont, now Carol Graham, who plays Big Mabel. And you can tell from this shot, for the women at least, they were not acting that day. They're in their own clothing, contemporary clothing, but are on the set relaxing and watching what's going on. Now I'm going to play some audio. This is Carol Graham's memories of the relations between town and cast during the shoot.
But I remember there was a favorite place that we all used to love to go. I think it was the Red Barn.
A restaurant.
Yes, and it was just great, and we'd eat ourselves crazy and all that. And we had a good time. We really had a good time. It was a fun time, and of course the people of Fort Scott were totally enthusiastic because so many of them were used in the film, you know. as extras, and so there was a great camaraderie, you know. But I remember there was a favorite place that we all used to.
This is a shot of Gordon Parks and Carol in the cemetery, probably around the shoot of the funeral scene. You may recall from the movie begins when Big Mabel rescues Newt from the tornado, and they have a scene in the barn. That was actually shot, the interior was shot in Los Angeles. And I asked Carol about shooting that scene, and I'm just going to include a little audio of her memory of that, because I think it reveals a lot about what it was like to work with Gordon Parks.
And I remember that day, it was a rainy day, and my husband was down with the flu and very sick, and I was hoping that I wasn't coming down, and it just weighed on me, you know, and then I knew we had to do this shoot where there again I was going to be in water and hosed down and wet and what have you, and I had to reveal at least to here.
Right.
And I was very nervous about it. And I told Gordon, you know, and everybody had gathered around. And I took him aside and I said, you know what, I'm really uptight about this. You know, to be honest. He says, okay, I understand. He said, why don't I clear the set and have nothing but a skeleton crew? I said, that'll work. Mm-hmm. And when he did that, it went very well.
So those are just a few of the images that we have in this archive that I wanted to share with you. And we want to open up for discussion. I see that already somebody has written an interesting discussion in the Q&A, and Kirk wants to speak. So let me, I have some questions I want to ask, but I'd like to hear what Kirk has to say if we can switch over to him.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everybody. Hi, Katherine. Hi, Tyra. Hi, Aileen. How's everybody doing?
Hi, Kirk.
We're good.
Enjoying everything. Everything's wonderful. Love the photos. And yes, I just wanted to mention thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for this program, keeping the legacy alive of Gordon Parks and this wonderful, spectacular film that he directed, produced, did the soundtrack, did everything to that. It's a important film now as it was many, many years ago, and it still echoes. As far as my experiences with the filming is, I was just a young little fella during that time when the film was being filmed here in Fort Scott. But however, my older sisters were part of the extras, just as many other people here in the community at that time. And some of their memories of it is just very special because it's excitement. Of course, not too many towns can brag that they're going to have Warner Brothers and their very own native son come home and do a movie there too as well. And so we were fortunate. My mother had one of them old school 16 millimeter cameras and took some footage of those times of Gordon and Carol and Kyle and the rest of the actors during that time. So yeah, from behind the scenes, and I don't want to take too much of time, but we're working on a project that you may or may not know about the actual scene locations here in Fort Scott, and we're working on signage with behind the scene photos. And so we've just came from a scene we found about a week or two ago, one of the barn scenes, and it's like we're walking. This one is very special because it's like you're walking in time. So I just wanted to just mention that too a little bit. So throw that out.
Actually, that's a good segue, Kirk and Katie and Tara, to the first question we got from Wendy Moreland, where she says that she's wondering how many of the locations Parks referenced in Cherokee Falls are actual locations in Fort Scott, Kansas. And I think Kirk, maybe you know.
Okay. Am I still unmuted? Okay. Yes, this project, we'll talk a little bit about that. We got a grant from Humanities Kansas, along with Fort Scott Community Area Foundation, grant to support our project. It's called the Learning Tree Film Scene Trail Location. So we identified, we have at least 13 scenes. There's more scenes than that, but at least 13 that we really want to identify as a filming scene location that's here in Fort Scott. And that also includes filming that took place in Mound City, Kansas. It's approximately 20 miles north from us. And that's when they did the courtroom scene. So with that project, we're going to install permanent signage at these locations with behind the scene images, text information, along with the QR code for more information about each scene, each movie, maybe with some fun facts. For instance, one of the fun facts we found out, one of the apple scenes that some of the ducks flying over, they said they had trouble with the ducks because they kept on going for the fake apple. So we just have some fun tidbits with that, some information about the filming, what they used to create the tornado scenes. We've also going to try to do a virtual tour with that too as well. So folks that staying at home don't have the availability at the moment with the pandemic, of course, to come to Fort Scott to look at the trail. They can experience some of that online too as well. And so one of the things we just want to do, create a trail where folks can come and just visit. Another feature of the museum of Fort Scott, Kansas too as well. So some of the scenes we have identified is the picnic scene at our local park, the river scene during where the shooting of the gambling took place, and then where the shootings of both the character Marcus and Captain Tuck. Also the swimming scene too as well. Kind of the scene where they're eating the apples after they steal the apples from Jake Heiner's farm. We have that scene available. We have the church scene location. We have the school location where they did the scene at the school. We have the Jefferson home that is currently, well, it was even then, it was on the property of the National Historic Site. So we have that location. We have the opening barn scene that Carol talked about, that exterior scene in the hill and the tornado. We have Jake Heiner's farm with the apple orchard, and the barn, when I tell you everything looks just like it did in 1968, it looks just, it's in great shape. The barn, the house, everything. It was a great find. We came across that a week ago or so, and we just took some photos of that today. We have the scene to where, toward the end of the film, where Newt is walking with Uncle Rob to the railroad tracks. It looks pretty much the same too as well. Judge Kavanaugh's house is very much pretty much the same on the outside, just kind of different variations, but vividly tell it's the same location. And the funeral scene with the cemetery too as well. We were able to find that location, an actual location, pinpoint that. And there's some other scenes too we're going to feature too as well, but we really wanted to get some of those big major ones, and I think we're coming across some more scenes as we're working on this project. And our goal is to have this complete by August 1st and have available for this October celebration that we have each year for the Gordon Parks annual celebration, to have those in place.
Thank you, Kirk.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Kirk. Did you want to say something else? Well, thank you, Kirk, for sharing all of that. That is really exciting, and I must say that Kirk gave me a tour of all those locations, and it's really fun. So when Kirk has that all set up with the signage and everything, it's going to be wonderful. And I would like to go next to our Beach Museum of Art director Linda Duke, who would like to chime in.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just thinking your project sounds so exciting, Kirk, and we could give you some information about Smartify, which might allow visitors to use their cell phones and point them at the signs on the locations that you're marking and get more information, because Smartify can even be used to link them to video or text or audio. And it just might be a tool that could be useful.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for that.
Yep, our beach museum, we're using Smartify, and our current exhibition Inside Out, which is, you can walk around the beach museum building and there are works of art on the windows, and we use Smartify where viewers can take a scan of the sign and they get more information on each work of art.
And that's exactly what we're looking for.
Yeah, it's really good to use. So, and I'll just give a plug in those of you who have not seen Inside Out, excuse me, please come and check it out and do try out the Smartify app. So Katie, would you like to continue with your discussion question?
Well, I'd be interested to know from people who've seen the movie or read the book, how you feel Kansas was depicted. And interestingly, there's a question in the chat now from Hannah Palsa, which I'll read. As a historian, I'm curious to know how Gordon Parks' experience in his youth either mirrored or was an anomaly to the Black childhood experience in the Midwest. So I think these two questions are related. If people would like to chime in on their impressions of how Kansas is represented in the learning tree.
While people raise their hand and type, can I share my experience of watching the film? I grew up watching Westerns with my dad on Sunday. So we watched Gunsmoke and Big Valley and Bonanza, and I have not read the book. When I turned on the film, the first thing I thought is I'm watching Western. I clicked on the wrong thing. It was so amazing to me. And what was the most interesting was as it pans and I see Black men on horses. In my whole Western watching career, which is not as vast as others, I've never seen a Black person on a horse. And it was amazing to me as I kept watching and knowing that this took place in Kansas, in Fort Scott. It was not what I was picturing the film to be like. And I'm curious if other people were surprised as me, or am I the only one who had a different perspective of Kansas in that time period? Oh, I have some hands. How about Hannah, do you want to chime in or unmute yourself and share?
There you go. I think it's interesting because I know that at least in some of the history classes that I've taken, we've talked about the rise of the African-American cowboy and how Black settlers moving out west are what we should really be thinking of as traditional cowboys and ranchers rather than the white depictions in Hollywood. And so I think it was interesting to me too to see them on horses doing more of farm work rather than I think what I would have thought typically in terms of more cattle raising and things.
Yeah, I'm not a historian, but I know that in that time period, if you didn't have a car, you were walking or you were riding a horse, so it should make sense. I think for me, what was interesting is because of the genre, I haven't seen a lot of movies where there were actors who were people of color, and oftentimes they weren't. The actor was not a person of color, so it would have been a white person playing someone who's Comanche or something to that effect. So seeing that was really interesting. I was talking to Katie last week about the film, and something else that was amazing to me was the way people spoke to each other. I was expecting a lot less casual conversation when people were talking. I thought people would be a lot more formal, especially when it came to race and hierarchy of our class. And that was a really fascinating thing for me to see.
Are there anybody here who would like to chime in on that question? You know, how accurate or not was the experience of or the portrayal of Kansas in 1920s?
Well, I would just like to share my great grandfather was very active in fighting against the Ku Klux Klan, which during this period was pretty rampant in Kansas, and that's something that you know is sort of a part of Kansas history that we sort of like to gloss over. You know, we were the Free State and things like that. But I remember a story about my great aunt that always kind of makes me think about some of the scenes where Parks is talking about the high school. And one of the sort of family stories that came down is how my great aunt took an African-American student into the women's lounge in Emporia High School. And they only had one school in Emporia, so they did not have a separate high school for African-American students, but everything was still very segregated within the school. And this caused great, you know, sort of chaos and havoc and outrage that she would bring an African-American fellow student into the women's lounge, which was only for white students. And going along with that, I think there was a Klan parade in Emporia, and they managed to find the head poobah's or whatever he was, dog, and let him loose so that the dog ran into the parade and identified his master, thus outing the Klan the Klan head. But you know, I think it's something that we tend to forget, is that, you know, we think of bleeding Kansas and Kansas fighting for Free State, but, you know, here we are 20 years after all of that, and it's still a very, very segregated state. And so I think there's a part of this book that's always really struck me along those lines, is, you know, that it's really you know, reminding us that things, you know, didn't just change overnight.
I think, Katherine, it was a really interesting experience. There's a scene in the book, in the very beginning of the book, where Jack Winger, Newt's father, is repairing a steeple of a church after the tornado comes through. And he looks out over the town and says that Kansas is a mixed state that gives with one hand and takes with the other. And I think that's one of my favorite quotes from the book, but I think sums up a lot of Gordon Parks's ambivalence about Kansas, that in some ways, you know, yeah, it was a free state. It had a very progressive history and still had progressive elements, like your great-grandfather who fought the Klan, and yet there was also the rise of the Klan and other segregationist elements. And I think we see that through the movie. You know, if you recall the scene with the principal, you know, there was the racist teacher, and then the principal comes in and says, well, we got to put an end to this. So I think both book and movie do a good job of showing this sort of tug of war that was going on in Kansas at the time. And just one thing to stress what Tara was saying about the Cowboys. Newt's brother Pete, it's more clear, I think, in the book. It was an actual working cowboy. And a lot of the visual vocabulary of the film of The Learning Tree is quoting a lot of genres. You know, the tornado scene in the beginning is a kind of homage to The Wizard of Oz, you know, the great Kansas film, The Wizard of Oz. And there's a absolutely gorgeous shot in the learning tree after the tornado, when Jack, Newt's father and brother, Jack and Pete, come out to rescue Newt and Mabel on their horses in front of this huge blood red sky. And it's just this classic Western shot. And it puts Jack and Pete in a very heroic frame, I think. And this always interests me in terms of adaptation, because both characters are much more fleshed out in the novel, and they do these really heroic things that there's just not time to go into in the movie. So instead, framing them in this shot in a kind of classic Western setting sun, the two men on horseback, kind of gives us the vocabulary that we need to know that these are two heroic men, cowboys. And I think that was an interesting way to incorporate that. And just to answer Shannon's question, and I think Kirk can speak to this too, he asked what was the response of the community when the movie opened. They did have a big premiere in Fort Scott, and Carol Graham talks about this in her interview, where they all went, Gordon Parks and much of the cast went to open the movie in Fort Scott, and it was a very big deal. And I know Kirk can speak to this at the Fort Scott Museum. There's a lot of clips of, newspaper coverage of this very big event. So he really kept that goodwill open between the movie crew and Fort Scott, even after they had left and brought the movie there to premiere.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, Kurt, go ahead.
Yes, they really did it up for the premiere here in Fort Scott. I think it happened that fall on September 24th. But again, you mentioned about it was there were some folks in the community who really didn't want it to be here because of that. But Gordon visited with some of the leaders here in the community at the time, and the mayor was very supportive of Gordon, of this project, and they've had meetings, and then they came up with a Gordon Parks Day right before that, and that helped to introduce the community to the book, to the film. Warner Brothers were there, all the actors were there. They ran out the red carpet for him. It was a wonderful day, and I think Gordon's quote is like, "This isn't a day for Gordon Parks, this is a day for Sarah Parks," who inspired him to do that too as well. So it was full event to where people in the community came and got autographs. They learned more about the film, what the film was about, and that garnered a lot of support right there from the get-go. And because there was some misconception, because a lot of people did not read the book. They just went by what they thought they heard or what they think they know versus what's the actual truth is out there. So, and then of course they did the big national premiere in New York with that, but they also did the premiere here in Fort Scott. And they even did have a wind down party too as well with the community. So it brought a lot of revenue, you can imagine, to the community at the time. And there's some great connections that from the cast and crew, met some families, and I think they became lifelong friends after that. And so it was just everything you could think of. It was just having a whole studio coming into your community for your hotels and restaurants and all sorts of things that goes with that.
I'm just gonna chime in that Shannon Skelton, who I believe is leading the Beach Museum of Art's movie club program this semester, was saying that that time when Parks was filming The Learning Tree, that it was an interesting time, with Warner Brothers, 7 Arts, in this interesting time, the studio system and within Warner Brothers organization. And I also wanted to pivot back to what Tara was saying about cowboys, Black cowboys. And I remember K-State Libraries hosting a talk by a historian who, his research proved that there were a lot of Black cowboys. And yet, when Hollywood depicts, the cowboy era or Western era, then everybody, all the heroic cowboys are white. And that's a specific interpretation by Hollywood that has kind of warped our perception of history. And yeah, Shannon also mentioned that. I'd like to pivot back to Tara. Tara, can you, chime in with some more observations or maybe a discussion question?
Yeah, I want to start with a comment that came from Suzanne Gleemore. And she said that she found parts of the movie difficult to watch. And I also felt that way too. There are things, and it doesn't have to be violence necessarily, but the scenes that come to mind are after the sheriff pays the boys to go in the river and pull out a dead body, hurt my heart. And that was the start of things that made me a little uncomfortable, a lot uncomfortable, but definitely hard to watch. And I was sharing with the group before this that when I watched the section of the film where they pay the boys to fight each other, I had to fast forward. And when you think of all the things that happen in the film, that's really not as terrible as others. But the idea that there could be a person who would pay young people to beat each other up for the entertainment of others, primarily because they're Black and young men, hurt me. And I just couldn't watch that. And it's not like a horror film today or anything as graphic as what you would see in a film now, but just a little heartbreaking to know that there would be someone who would get joy out of that. And there were a couple of scenes that were just a little too real for me to partake in. And I have given myself permission a long time ago to skip pages in a book that hurt, to fast forward through films or TV shows that are going to cause pain when I'm not quite ready for it. And I don't know if I'm glad to say I'm not the only one, but it's good to know that there are people who are perhaps as maybe as sensitive or soft-hearted when it comes to that as I am.
And I'm just going to chime in that, Tara, Katie, and me, the three of us had a discussion about that, and how it was really disturbing because you notice immediately that the people in that battle royale scene are young people of color. There were two who looked like they could have a Latin American descent. Mm-hmm. And we had wondered, was that confined to people of color, and tried to think of were there other historical moments where, white people were in that battle royale scene, fighting, beating each other up for other people's entertainment. And Katie had said, well, we were wondering about the Irish community, for example. And there is that instance too, of Irish immigrants who would fight, in a ring, boxing. And so we kind of came to the conclusion that it seems like the people who are in that battle royale situation are not just people of color, but more broadly, people who are low in the social class. Mm-hmm. Are the ones who are made to do something like this, or people who are marginalized. And it's not just people of color, but people defined by their economic or immigration status.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and then this is a really fun family affair. This is a place to play games and eat snacks. And then we have someone who is making money off of kids fighting each other. In the chat, there is a comment about the disregard for humanity of these children is really tough, and I agree. And I want to say another thing that came through the chat is from Mark Carlson, and he mentions a couple movies where they depict Black Cowboy, Silverado, Lonesome Dove, which is great. I have not seen those movies. My time of watching Westerns is specific to being young and watching it with my dad when cartoons were on Sunday morning. But I really appreciate seeing these other films. I'm always fascinated by people who will go back and show history from different perspectives and angles. And I don't see that very often. So thank you for pointing out those films, because I would like to go back and watch some of those.
There's a question here actually about from Allison Wheatley, that panelists and people in the audience who might know could chime in about how did the community in Fort Scott respond in 1969 to the racism, terrible racism depicted in the film?
Maybe Kirk would like to answer that.
Kirk, do you have any thoughts about that?
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
How did the community, and I assume it means Fort Scott, respond in 1969 to the terrible racism depicted in the film?
I think for the most part, naturally so, embarrassed on some of the things and probably in disbelief. But of course, this is 1969 when the film was released, so things are obviously better than when Gordon depicted it in 1920 to a certain degree. But we're still going through the civil rights at the moment, so some things, desegregation has ended, but it's still holding on to those same old Jim Crow law values that Kansas just couldn't escape. Racism continues to be a thing, but a lot of us pride too as well, that the pride that the film was successful, Gordon was successful, and that it happened here in Fort Scott. So many things that Gordon depicted into the book, into the film. Of course, it's a semi-autobiography of Gordon's life growing up in Fort Scott. But for instance, when Tara mentioned about the sheriff paying the boys to dive into the river to pick up a dead body, that actual event did happen with Gordon, with his friend, not the actual Captain Tuck, but he was paid by it. So these are paid by a sheriff and his friend to go down and dig up a dead body. And Gordon had a difficult time with death during that time because he had to deal with that. He had visions and nightmares of that. And also the character Captain Tuck is a real character that actually was mysteriously killed, not in the river, but was actually killed down in railroad tracks mysteriously. And Gordon knew Captain Tuck, and him and his friend went to go visit him at the funeral home. Well, some older white gentleman thought they was being funny, was being very cruel and racist and hurtful. They let Gordon go in there to the room by himself to view the body, but then they shut the door and locked him in there for a long period of time. And so that devastated Gordon's and fear, and heightened his fear of death too as well. And I don't think he really got over that until he came to grips with his mother passing. So Gordon took a lot of things that happened into his life and kind of put that into the learning tree, into the book, and kind of storied that too with that. Like, for instance, you mentioned about the segregation of going to different places. And the scene in the film, if you recall, he goes in with the character Chauncey and his girlfriend at the time, Arcella, into the drugstore to order some ice cream or soda. And then they were immediately isolated, picked out by the waiter, and says they can't eat in here, and they had to eat outside. So that kind of, Gordon used that in real life. That happened in Fort Scott. That's a segregation because blacks could go into drugstores, order the ice cream, order their sodas, but they had to eat outside. And if you look at the book, Back to Fort Scott, Gordon depicts that in the book too as well, and shows of that. And Gordon mentions when he comes back in Fort Scott in 1968, 69 to do the filming, he recognizes that Fort Scott has came a long, long way, because now blacks can, there's no segregation, and there's blacks on the athletic teams, because during that time, blacks could go to the high school here. It was integrated, but at the same time, it was segregated because blacks could not participate in athletics, sports, social activities. And Gordon, of course, graduated and went to grade school, segregated school here in the community. And so Gordon himself attested that the Fort Scott has come a long way, because the Learn Tree has opened its doors to places that normally Gordon would not be allowed to go into in the past in Fort Scott, in the community, to different clubs, organization, and events. And so he mentions that it's a wonderful thing that he can see white crew members working together with black crew members, and it's a different feel, and they're learning from one another. And it's almost they're bonding because they know they're on a historical path, and I think that's why Gordon works so hard with that. And to me, I don't think Gordon has to work very hard to do anything because he just does everything so wonderfully and exemplary. So so for the long, I think it's just mixed emotions. I think for one, for the community and the success of it, that pride, and then also some that's probably shame of what they experienced. And so I think that's some of the reflections from that.
Thank you, Kirk. I'd like to turn to another question, and this one is for Katie. Hannah Palsa is wondering if you have information about how the learning tree may have opened the doors for Black actors and African Americans working in film, or did it stereotype them?
I don't think it changed things significantly. Of course, it's been a long struggle of Black actors in Hollywood to get roles, period, and to get roles that are not stereotypical. It's interesting. The cast of the Learning Tree is really a really interesting cast, though, which involves obviously some very young actors, and also some veteran actors. Joel Fluellen, who played Uncle Rob, really interesting character who went back to, sorry, my dog is barking, who goes back to Hollywood in the 1930s, who used to hang out with Billie Holiday. And I mean, he was like a very kind of flamboyant character in the 1930s Hollywood. I was reading about him in a book and I was like, Uncle Rob, really? You know, because he's a good actor, so he's playing a very different kind of character. Estelle Evans, who plays Sarah, a veteran actress too. But you know, I think it's just was in particular in the 1960s and 70s a challenge for Black actors to find non-stereotypical roles. And while The Learning Tree was a significant movie in many ways, I don't think it really changed that struggle all that much. And I think it actually continues today. Things are better today than they might have been in the 60s, but I think it still continued to be a struggle. And also, yes, just those who don't know Kyle Johnson, who plays Newt, it was his mother was Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhuru in Star Wars. And it was actually, you know, she knew about that they were casting for the movie and encouraged Kyle to get that role.
Oh, Katie, thank you for that bit of information. I think that we will have to wrap up soon, but I think we can go to one comment or question from Jerry Craig.
Oh, thanks, Aileen, and thanks for putting this together. It's wonderful. And I have sort of this complicated question about aesthetics for Gordon Parks. And like Kirk was saying, he does everything so well, but I've just had this recognition that as much as I always have loved his compositions and his photographs and his films, and sometimes it just like takes my breath away, and I can't always explain or understand why, but I read a poem of his about growing up in Fort Scott, and it was very beautiful, about kind of like summertime in Kansas. It made you think of that swimming scene, right? And the flowers and the warmth and the sun on your head. And I mean, I don't remember it, but then at one point, just so fast it turns, and about the, you know, the hate, the hurt that you can experience there. And so when Tara was talking about the boys being paid to fight, it reminded me of that and how compositionally or aesthetically he can make you feel such warmth and tenderness, and then it just flips, and so it's just that much harder to kind of bear. But I didn't know if anyone had written about his whole, you know, I guess this is for Katie and Tara, about his writing relative to his, you know, kind of aesthetics or compositions, and that crossover between those mediums. I don't know, so it's kind of a hard question, I know.
Katie question.
I'm I'm not sure. It's something that, you know, I know Cameron and I have been thinking a lot about and you know, trying to approach through our writing. He's an amazing writer. And I actually feel like The Learning Tree is a book standing alone from who Gordon Parks is and the movie and everything. It's really, it's a great book. It's a beautifully written book. And one of the things that I've always felt about the book, this doesn't really answer Jerry's question about the aesthetics, but you know, it came out a couple of years after To Kill a Mockingbird. And like To Kill a Mockingbird has a trial at the center. And you know, has a kind of similar structure, except that To Kill a Mockingbird was a story about racism that didn't have too many Black characters in it. And in The Learning Tree, Black characters get to take center stage. And I think that's a really significant contribution to the literature. But I don't know. I mean, I think Jerry raises some really interesting questions that are worth thinking about, really, even on a shot by shot basis, you know, how his aesthetics as a photographer, which he was first, informs his aesthetics as a writer.
All right.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. This has been a wonderful discussion. And like I said, we could go on and on. I even had other questions that I didn't get to. And I hope everyone to, you know, please join us for future programs. And we'll have, you know, a series of programs related to Gordon Parks, you know, later on, you know, especially when the exhibition opens and when the digital archive launches. They're going to do that at the same time in the fall. So please watch out for more Gordon Parks programming. Thank you, everyone. And we'll end the program here. So you're welcome to sign off. Goodbye.